Now, this is just how it is, based upon that north, south, east, west magnetic pole. But if we want to look how all these elements are affecting life, how they're working in a life process, we have to change the orientation from the external environment to the internal physical. So what we can do is we can just rotate this just that little bit so that now we have it based this way upon the internal physical body. And look what we've got sitting at the bottom here. Carbon is sitting right there as the base element of physical manifestation. Under it is silica. And so we are silica framed with carbon based upon it. So this is just sitting there. Now, at this point, I'd like to be able to say, can you see it? What's going on here? Because when we look at this process here, we've got aluminium silicate sitting here, which is clay. Okay? And just above it, we've got boron, carbon, nitrogen, and of course in the middle, hydrogen. Now what's that? What's that substance that's going to contain those elements? Humus. This is where we find the boron in our garden. It's most stable in the humus, as well as nitrogen. It's the most stable form of nitrogen is in humus. And it uses the carbon and the hydrogen to be a base. So that's where we find humus. So look at that next layer up. These are the calcium, magnesium, sulfur, oxygen. These are all the elements that lead to good leaf growth that are taking place. Now we look above that to the next layer, and what's potassium chloride used for? It's used for growing really good fruit. So what we've got sitting in that picture is the picture of the threefold processes that we've been identifying all through my talks. So that's just sitting there. Now, one of the interesting processes is that we've got this Sal, Sulf, Mercury, which is the consolidating processes into the head. The old alchemists called a Sal process, or a salt process, or a crystallizing process. Then we have the metabolic process they called a sulf, so it was sort of burning up, it was turning into this ethereal gas. And in the middle is the rhythmic mercury process that works in the middle here. So this is the structure of old alchemy, in fact, and Steiner has brought it forwards. Now the question comes, how can we look further into this? And this picture is the metallic states. So again, it's just science. This is just science. And so what it's showing us is that these brown elements are all considered metals. The green elements are these in-between substances that are metals and non-metals. And then the blue ones are non-metals. And then this is the gases, the noble gases. And so even just looking at that picture, we can identify that there's this quite different quality to these two sides of this structure. And so we can put on what we've already got, which is these parts of the plant. But then we can identify that these metals are much more dense and consolidated and contracted than the non-metals. And so we can start to see that we have a Sal and a Sulf process running in there as well. At this point, what we can start to identify is that we have these elements here, phosphorus, sulfur, and chlorine, and sodium, magnesium, and aluminium. Now Steiner talks about all this in the 1920 and 1921 medical lectures. And especially in the last half of the 1920 lectures, he starts to identify these these 6 processes that are taking place within this structure. And what are we doing? Okay, so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to pick up this circle. In our story, this is the spirit circle, this is the astral circle, this is the etheric circle, this is the physical circle. So these are the elements of the physical body. So we're going to pick them up and we'll just take them to the next step. Okay, there's our nerve sense and so on system. And we just put those elements around there. And now what I get out of this, sort of a pictorial image that I get out of this, is that the carbon and the silica are the sort of manifesting clay. They're the bits that are going to do the manifesting. And so what we've got are these other elements here that are going to be interactive, that affect this. Now these are the noble gases. So they're just there. They're just hanging around in the space. And while they don't interact with anything, they do add their atomic weight to the environment. So they are active. They're not talking to anyone, but they're active. So they're like a little chaotic element that is going to work with this other somewhat chaotic element to become the manifestation of the interaction between this process. And so how can we identify what these processes are? And Rudolf Steiner does this in these lectures. Okay, so first of all, he gives the story of how these different processes are all related here. He talks a lot about sodium. He talks a lot about phosphorus as these primary basic elements. But he then goes on and he identifies how the metals are related. Once we put the metals on there, we can identify how the planets work, which he puts on there. Within this story, we can bring in these elements from biodynamics, that in the nerve sense system we have the earthly matter and the cosmic forces and earthly forces. So we can bring all that in. But what we can also start to identify is that we've got this division here, that while this is the cell processes and this is the sulf, this is the cell part of the sulf, whereas this is the sulf, and so this is the middle, sulf, mercury. And similarly, sulf, mercury, sulf. So we're being able to identify these sort of qualities of these elements in finer detail.